A white van sat idling just beyond the palace gates, windows tinted, engine running. Most people in the crowd thought nothing of it, just another delivery, but one 9-year-old girl knew better. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She raised her hand and gave the secret signal every child is taught, but prays never to use. One royal guard saw it, and in that instant, 3 centuries of protocol shattered. But what did he uncover inside that van? And why did it bring the entire ceremony to a dead stop? Before we show you exactly what unfolded in those terrifying minutes, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The late morning sun pooled across Buckingham Palace, turning the cream stone golden. Tourists pressed 3 deep against the black gates, phones raised, voices weaving together in half a dozen languages. Behind the ancient walls, the regimental band warmed up with brass notes that echoed off stone. To everyone gathered there, this was pure pageantry, but to Sergeant Marcus Kellan, standing motionless in his scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat, it was something else entirely. It was vigilance. At 38, Marcus carried himself with gravity earned from years in Helmand province, where he'd learned to read crowds like newspapers. Shrapnel in his left calf had left him with a barely noticeable limp, but it had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. His scarlet tunic fit perfectly, gold buttons catching sunlight. The rifle against his shoulder wasn't just for show, though tourists pointing cameras had no way of knowing that. Standing still for hours was its own endurance test, but Marcus used that stillness productively. His eyes moved constantly, cataloguing faces, noting patterns, filing away details that might matter when everything went wrong. The band struck its first proper chord of the day, brass blazing across the forecourt like a call to arms. The crowd surged forward with collective excitement, but through all that golden sunlight and pageantry, Marcus's attention snagged on something that didn't fit the pattern. A little girl stood at the edge of the crowd, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing a blue cotton dress with a cardigan that hung loose on her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that was coming undone, one ribbon trailing in the breeze. She carried a battered satchel that looked like it had seen better years, its strap fraying where it bit into her shoulder. While every other child in that square was wide-eyed and laughing, pointing at the scarlet uniforms and gleaming instruments, she wasn't looking at the ceremony at all. Her gaze was fixed somewhere else entirely, across the service road where a white delivery van sat idling at the curb. Marcus felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the one that had kept him alive in places where paying attention was the difference between coming home and not. The van looked ordinary enough. Peeling paint, faded courier logo on the side, the kind of vehicle that blended into London traffic like water into water. But it had been sitting there for 20 minutes with its engine running, exhaust puffing steadily into the morning air. What bothered Marcus more was the girl's behaviour. Children notice things adults missed, but they usually expressed it differently. Squirming, tugging sleeves, asking endless questions. This girl was doing none of that. She walked small, deliberate circles at the crowd's edge, like she was trying to decide whether to step forward or disappear entirely. Every few seconds, her eyes would dart from the van to the guards, then back again, calculating something. She wasn't lost, she wasn't confused, she was afraid. Marcus shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, enough to keep her in his peripheral vision without drawing attention from the cameras pointed his way. Whatever was pulling her gaze toward that van was strong enough to eclipse everything else happening around her, the music, the pageantry, the once-in-a-lifetime spectacle that had drawn tourists from around the world. The band's volume swelled, drums rolling like distant thunder, and the girl took a hesitant step toward the ceremonial ropes. But she wasn't moving toward the music. She was positioning herself where Marcus could see her clearly, where there was no mistaking her intent. That's when she looked directly at him and raised her hand, palm open, thumb tucked, fingers folding down in a movement so quick it could have been mistaken for brushing hair from her face. But Marcus knew better. He'd been briefed on the universal distress signal taught in schools across Britain, designed for moments when screaming might make things worse, when a child couldn't risk being heard. The signal meant one thing and one thing only: help me. Every fibre of 3 centuries of tradition told him to stay locked in place. Guards didn't move. Guards didn't break formation. Guards were living statues who absorbed whatever chaos swirled around them without flinching. But as the girl repeated the signal, smaller this time, more desperate, Marcus felt his body decide before his mind caught up. The crack of his boots against ancient cobblestone split the morning air like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the sound, phones swinging his direction, tourists gasping in confusion. In 362 years of ceremonial duty, no guardsman had ever broken formation. Until now. Marcus moved with the fluid economy of muscle memory, forged in places where hesitation meant death. His scarlet tunic blazed against the pale stone as he strode toward the rope barrier, rifle shifting from ceremonial angle to something more purposeful. The bare skin that had shadowed his features now seemed to crown him with authority rather than hide him in tradition. The crowd parted before him like water, confusion rippling through the mass of bodies. Some laughed nervously, thinking this might be some kind of special performance they hadn't read about in their guidebooks. Others sensed something deeper happening, something that had nothing to do with pageantry. When Marcus reached the rope line, he knelt slightly to meet the girl's eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. Her face was pale, but determined, like she'd been carrying a terrible weight, and had finally found someone strong enough to help her bear it. "Over there," she whispered, voice almost lost beneath the brass and drums, still playing behind the palace gates. Her chin tilted toward the service lane, where the white van continued its patient idle. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had commanded soldiers under fire. "Stay here." She shook her head desperately, clutching her satchel like a shield. "They told me not to say a word," she breathed, and in those 7 words, Marcus heard everything he needed to know about why she was afraid. He pressed the radio button on his cuff, keeping his tone steady, though his jaw had locked tight with understanding. "Control, this is Post 7. Possible child safety concern. White delivery van adjacent to service lane. Driver occupied. Request immediate security support." The response crackled back through static. "Copy that. Post 7. Security dispatching. Maintain visual." Marcus rose to his full height, gesturing for nearby tourists to gently guide the girl back from the barrier. She pressed herself against the ropes, small fingers white-knuckled around the metal, her eyes following him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and dangerous. He turned toward the van, and the moment his boots hit the service road, everything clicked into focus with the crystal clarity that came from years of reading situations where lives hung in the balance. The van sat wrong, engine idling with that steady rumble that spoke of someone ready to move at a moment's notice, but no clipboard visible on the dashboard, no delivery schedule tucked behind the windscreen wipers, no hazard lights flashing the way they should for a legitimate stop. The paint on the panels had blistered and peeled in patches, revealing mismatched colours beneath, like someone had tried to change the vehicle's appearance in a hurry. Through the tinted windscreen, Marcus could make out the pale silhouette of the driver. The man wasn't fidgeting the way people do when they're legitimately waiting for something. He wasn't checking his phone or drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He just sat there with unnatural stillness, hands positioned somewhere below Marcus's line of sight. Marcus approached with measured steps. Behind him, phones clicked, some tourists clapping, thinking this was unscheduled theatre. But the tight line of his jaw said otherwise. He stopped one pace from the driver's window. "Step out of the vehicle." The driver turned slowly, revealing bland features arranged into harmless confusion, but his eyes were wrong, too calculating. "I'm waiting for a friend," the man said with false calm. "Engine off!" "Step out of the vehicle," Marcus repeated. That's when he saw it. Rope coiled on the passenger seat, and beyond it, a child's jacket with pink lining crumpled against the rear floor. On the dashboard, a smartphone glowed with an unlocked message. "Stand by for green light." "Hands where I can see them," Marcus ordered, shifting his rifle to ready position without raising it to his shoulder. The driver's nostrils flared, but he lifted his hands slowly to the steering wheel, fingers splayed wide in a mockery of cooperation. His eyes, though, had gone cold and calculating, like a predator caught in a trap and measuring his options for escape. Marcus reached the side door. The handle sat flush but unlocked, and when he tugged it open with deliberate care, the mechanism clicked with the sound of inevitability. The door slid back, and the world contracted to a single moment of horrible clarity. Two children lay crumpled on the bare metal floor, like discarded dolls. A boy and a girl, siblings by the look of their matching dark hair and identical school trainers. Duct tape sealed their mouths, plastic zip ties bound their wrists, and their small chests rose and fell in the shallow rhythm of drugged unconsciousness. The gasp that tore through the watching crowd was like wind through dry leaves. Behind the palace gates, the regimental band faltered mid-note, brass instruments choking into silence as word spread through the musicians that something was terribly wrong. The ceremony died in that moment, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to echo off the ancient stones. Marcus felt his stomach drop, the shock of recognition hitting like a physical blow. He'd seen many horrors in his time, bodies in Afghan alleyways, children pressed into carrying explosives, but finding this here, in the heart of London, under the shadow of Buckingham Palace, froze him with a different kind of rage entirely. The driver twisted toward the gear shift, desperation overriding whatever calm he'd managed to maintain. Marcus's rifle snapped into position, barrel angled with lethal promise. "Don't!" The word carried the weight of absolute authority, vibrating in the silence that had fallen over the forecourt. Behind the ceremonial ropes, tourists were no longer murmuring about performances or theatrical flourishes. They were whispering, shouting, pointing, their phones capturing something that would be replayed on news channels around the world within the hour. The little girl, who had given the signal, pressed her hands over her mouth, eyes wide and wet with the confirmation of her worst fears. She had known. Somehow, she had known. Marcus didn't look back at her. His entire focus had narrowed to the man behind the wheel, the unconscious children in the van, and the rifle strap cutting into his shoulder as he held the weapon steady. Protocol was finished. Ceremony was finished. What came next was about something far more fundamental than tradition. The driver's hand hovered over the gear shift, like he was still considering his chances. In the profound silence left by the band's collapse, the sound of Marcus grinding his boots against tarmac was like thunder rolling across the forecourt. "Move once more and I fire," Marcus said, each word weighted with the kind of promise that had kept him alive in places where empty threats got you killed. The man froze, his mask of harmless confusion finally cracking completely, his lips peeled back in a snarl of frustrated rage. "You've no right—" Before he could finish the thought, palace security officers came running, their dark suits cutting through the bewildered tourists like knives through water. They spread around the van with professional efficiency, hands resting on holsters, voices low but urgent as they assessed the situation. "Guard 7 report," the lead officer called out. "2 minors inside," Marcus responded, without taking his eyes off the driver. "Bound and gagged, breathing shallow but steady. Driver refuses to comply with lawful orders." The lead officer swore under his breath and pressed his earpiece. "Control, we have confirmation. 2 children recovered from suspicious vehicle. Immediate police and ambulance response required. Lock down the perimeter." The crowd's murmur had become a roar of disbelief and shock. Some pressed forward, trying to see what had turned their morning of pageantry into something from a nightmare. Others pulled back, parents clutching their own children closer, as if the danger might somehow spread. That's when a small figure broke free from the mass of bodies. The girl who had signalled Marcus darted between startled adults and ran straight to his side, pressing herself against the back of his scarlet tunic. Her small fists clutched at the wool like it was the only solid thing left in a world gone mad. "They're my friends," she whispered, voice cracking with tears she'd been holding back. "He took them from school yesterday. I saw him talking to them by the gates." Marcus felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest. He shifted his stance subtly, widening his frame so his body fully blocked her from the driver's view. But he kept his rifle trained on the man behind the wheel, whose expression had shifted from frustrated anger to something far uglier. "Little liar," the driver spat, voice dripping with venom that made the surrounding officers tense visibly. Palace security closed their perimeter tighter. One officer edged toward the driver's side, his voice cutting across the tension. "Sir, exit the vehicle immediately. Keep your hands visible at all times." The driver's control finally snapped completely. He yanked the gear shift with desperate fury, the engine roaring as the van lurched forward. Tires squealed against ancient cobblestones. The girl behind Marcus shrieked and covered her ears, and for one horrible moment, it looked like he might actually escape. But Marcus didn't flinch. He planted his boots like tree roots. Rifle braced against his shoulder, and his voice exploded across the forecourt with the kind of authority that could stop a charging bull. "Engine off! Now!" The command rang off palace walls with such force that even the panicking tourists fell silent. The driver's hands shook on the steering wheel, caught between acceleration and the rifle barrel, aimed squarely at his chest. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, everything balanced on the edge of violence. Then the man made his choice. With a guttural roar of rage, he threw the door open and tried to bolt. Palace security swarmed him instantly. One officer slammed the door back against the van, another grabbed him by the collar and dragged him from the seat. He fought like a man possessed, elbows flying, curses tearing from his throat, desperation lending him strength. But they overwhelmed him through sheer numbers, driving him down against the tarmac, knees pinning him while metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. The crowd erupted in gasps and scattered applause, but the sound died quickly as everyone realized this wasn't entertainment. This was real. This was happening in front of their eyes. And then came the second shock that no one had expected. A figure in a dark hoodie broke from the far edge of the service lane, sprinting down the pavement like his life depended on reaching the corner before anyone could react. Marcus's combat instincts flared to life, and he pressed his radio without hesitation. "Second suspect, northbound on foot." Two officers peeled away from the crowd and pounded after him, their shoes echoing against stone as they closed the distance. The running man shoved pedestrians aside, nearly made it to the street, before a plain-clothes detective came out of nowhere and tackled him hard to the pavement. As they wrestled, a backpack spilled open across the sidewalk, scattering rope, duct tape, zip ties, and what looked like a detailed map of central London, with key locations circled in red ink. The girl clutched Marcus's tunic even tighter, her voice small but certain. "That's him too," she whispered. "He was waiting by the school gates. He's the one who helped take them." Marcus kept his rifle ready, eyes scanning for any other threats that might emerge from the chaos. "Not anymore," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second as police and ambulances raced toward the palace. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, promising help and justice, and the kind of reckoning that men who stole children had coming to them. The ceremony had stopped cold. The pageantry was gone, replaced by something raw and urgent and absolutely real. All that remained was the truth of what had almost happened, and the soldier in scarlet who had chosen to see it before it was too late. The first police car screamed into the service lane with a sharp turn that scattered gravel and sent tourists scrambling backward. A second vehicle followed close behind, blue lights painting the palace walls in urgent flashes of colour. Paramedics jumped out with medical bags bouncing on their shoulders, rushing toward the open van where two small lives hung in the balance. Marcus lowered his rifle and stepped aside, giving the medics room to work. They moved with practiced efficiency, cutting zip ties, peeling duct tape gently from small mouths, checking pulse rates and breathing patterns. The boy stirred first, coughing weakly as consciousness returned in painful stages. The girl whimpered as the tape came away, her eyes rolling before focusing enough to let tears spill down her cheeks. Both children were lifted carefully into thermal blankets, their small bodies disappearing into the careful hands of people trained to heal rather than harm. The crowd watched in complete silence now, parents pulling their own children closer, as if proximity to such evil might somehow be contagious. At Marcus's side, the girl who had saved them pressed her face into his red tunic, her voice muffled but unshakable. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "When I saw them getting into that van yesterday, they looked scared. But he told me I'd be in trouble if I said anything to anyone. He said no one would believe me anyway." Marcus felt his jaw flex with controlled anger. He placed one gloved hand briefly on her shoulder, steadying her, anchoring her to something solid, before palace security gently guided her toward a woman who had been fighting through the crowd with desperate determination. The reunion was brief and fierce, the mother's sobs carrying even above the wail of sirens as she wrapped her arms around her daughter like she might never let go again. But Marcus's attention had already shifted to the detective approaching, with his notebook out and his tie askew from chasing suspects. "These two were reported missing yesterday evening," the man said, his voice clipped with professional urgency. "Siblings named Ellie and Callum Harper. Disappeared while walking home from their primary school in Greenwich. We had no leads, no witnesses, nothing to work with. Until today." The words settled over the scene, like a weight that pressed down on everyone who heard them. Another story Marcus recognized from his years in service. Families left waiting by phones that never rang. Authorities chasing shadows that always stayed one step ahead. Only this time, those shadows had been dragged kicking and screaming into broad daylight. "Sergeant Kellan," another officer said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that meant difficult questions were coming. "You broke formation. You left your assigned post during active ceremonial duty." Marcus straightened to attention, rifle held with professional precision. "Sir, I observed a child making the universal distress signal. The situation required immediate response." The officer studied him for a long moment, jaw tightening as he processed the implications. Then he gestured toward the van where crime scene technicians were already photographing evidence. "Without your action, those children would be gone. You'll need to give a full statement inside." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself in a wood-panelled room that smelled of centuries of serious conversations, the kind of place where uncomfortable truths got discussed behind closed doors. His bearskin hat rested on a polished table, his scarlet tunic damp with sweat, despite the morning coolness. A major in full dress uniform sat across from him, flanked by a plainclothes investigator who kept scribbling notes in a worn notebook. The silence stretched until it became a presence of its own in the room. "Sergeant Kellan," the major began, his voice carefully neutral, "you understand the gravity of abandoning your ceremonial post." "Yes, sir. You are fully aware that such an action, unauthorized and unsignaled, can compromise not only the ceremony itself, but also security protocols and 3 centuries of unbroken tradition." "Yes, sir." The major leaned forward slightly, studying Marcus's face with the intensity of someone trying to read thoughts written in invisible ink. "Then explain to me why you chose to do it anyway." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Because a 9-year-old girl asked for help in the only way she could. And because 2 other children were already unconscious in the back of that van. Sir, with respect, no tradition is worth more than innocent lives." The investigator's pen scratched across paper, recording words that would be analysed and debated in review boards and parliamentary committees for weeks to come. The major's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested he was fighting his own battle between duty and conscience. Before anyone could respond, the door opened with a soft creak. The little girl stood in the doorway, her mother's protective arm around her shoulders, palace security hovering uncertainly behind them both. She stepped forward with the kind of determination that seemed too old for her young face, chin trembling, but her voice carrying clear across the room. "If he hadn't moved when I asked him to," she said simply, "Ellie and Callum would be gone forever. He listened when no one else did. He saw what I was trying to tell him." The room fell so quiet that Marcus could hear the ancient clock ticking in the corner, measuring out seconds that felt heavy with meaning. Even the investigator's pen had gone still. The girl looked directly at Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but steady with absolute certainty. "My teacher taught us that signal for when we can't speak, but we need help. I never thought I'd have to use it, but when I did, he saw me. That's what matters most, isn't it? That someone saw me when I needed them to." Marcus inclined his head toward her, not as acknowledgement of praise, but as recognition of a truth that transcended rank and protocol and centuries of tradition. Sometimes duty meant following orders. Sometimes it meant knowing when to break them. The Major cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "That will be all for now, Sergeant. There will be inquiries, review boards, questions from people who weren't here to see what you saw, but—" He paused, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped enough to show the man beneath it. "The regiment stands behind decisions made to protect innocent life. Dismissed." Marcus rose, saluted with parade ground precision, and walked toward the door. But as he passed the girl, she reached out and pressed something small into his hand, a folded piece of paper, warm from being clutched in her small fist. "I drew this while they were asking me questions," she whispered, "for you to remember." Outside in the corridor, Marcus unfolded the paper carefully. Inside was a drawing executed in coloured pencil, with the kind of careful attention to detail that made it unmistakably the work of someone who had watched the world closely and remembered what mattered. It showed a guardsman in full dress uniform standing protectively beside a small figure in a blue dress, both of them facing toward a white van where other small figures were being helped to safety. At the bottom, in careful handwriting that stayed perfectly within the lines, were the words, "Thank you for seeing my signal. Love, Emma." The guardsman, who had faced down armed kidnappers without flinching, felt his throat tighten with an emotion that had nothing to do with military bearing or ceremonial duty. He folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his inner pocket, where it would stay close to his heart for the rest of his life. By late afternoon, the forecourt had resumed something approaching its normal rhythm. The regimental band played again, though their music seemed softer somehow, as if the instruments themselves remembered what had happened in the morning shadows. Tourists pressed against the gates as they always did, but their chatter was different now, hushed, respectful, often accompanied by glances toward the service lane where the white van had been towed away under heavy police escort. And there, back at his assigned post, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis, stood Sergeant Marcus Kellan. His scarlet tunic was immaculate despite the morning's strain, rifle angled with mathematical precision, bearskin hat casting familiar shadows across his weathered face. To casual observers walking past with their cameras and guidebooks, he looked exactly like what they expected. Another ceremonial guard frozen in tradition, a living piece of British history performing his ancient duty. But for those who had been there that morning, who had witnessed the moment when 3 centuries of protocol shattered in the face of human need, the sight of him, standing silent and steady, was charged with something far deeper than pageantry. Phones still rose to capture his image, though fewer than before. The tourists who had seen too much seemed to lower their cameras quickly, almost out of respect. They whispered to each other instead, pointing discreetly. "That's him. That's the guard who moved. That's the one who saved them." The rescued siblings were already in hospital beds across London, wrapped in clean blankets, their names confirmed, their parents holding them with the fierce gratitude of people who had stared into the abyss and stepped back from its edge. Those reunions would never make headlines, but they would ripple through lives and families and communities forever. Emma, the girl whose courage had started it all, stood at the forecourt gates with her mother, both of them looking smaller somehow in the afternoon light. But when Emma's eyes found Marcus across the ceremonial distance that separated, she smiled for the first time that day. She tugged at her mother's coat, pointing toward the motionless figure in scarlet and black. "That's him, Mum," she said, voice carrying just far enough for Marcus to hear. "That's the one who listened when I couldn't speak." Her mother's face crumpled with emotion that had been building all day. She pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed a silent thank you toward the soldier who had chosen humanity over protocol when it mattered most. Marcus couldn't move from his post, couldn't speak while on ceremonial duty, couldn't even acknowledge their presence in any obvious way. But as Emma's gaze stayed fixed on him with absolute trust and gratitude, he tilted his head just slightly, a gesture invisible to most, but unmistakable to her. The girl nodded back, once certain. Then she turned into her mother's embrace, and together they walked away toward the safety of home and the promise of ordinary days ahead. Behind them, the ceremony continued with its timeless precision. Bands played music that had echoed off these walls for centuries. Guards moved through formations, perfected over generations of service. Tourists captured moments of spectacle that would fill photo albums and social media feeds around the world. But everyone who had been there that day understood they had witnessed something more than performance. They had seen history bend when it needed to bend, tradition flex when flexibility meant survival, and one man choose conscience over conformity when 3 young lives hung in the balance. Marcus stood unmoving as the afternoon shadows lengthened around him, a figure of scarlet and shadow carved from the same stone as the palace itself. To the world, he was once again just a guardsman at his post, part of the living museum that drew millions of visitors to witness British tradition. But for Emma, and for Ellie and Callum Harper sleeping safely in hospital beds, he was something else entirely. He was the one who had seen, the one who had acted, the one who had remembered that some duties transcended every rule ever written. And in the end, that was worth more than all the ceremony in the world. Would you have noticed Emma's desperate signal if you'd been standing in that crowd of tourists? Would you have seen what Sergeant Marcus Kellan saw, a child's silent cry for help, hidden in plain sight among all that pageantry and noise? And when 3 centuries of tradition came into conflict with 3 young lives in danger, do you think Marcus was right to shatter every protocol in the book? Or should ceremonial duty always come first, no matter what the cost? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely read every single response, and your perspectives matter to us. If this story moved you, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe with notifications turned on, because stories like this deserve to be shared, and we upload fresh content every single day. Share this video with someone who still thinks the Royal Guards are just for show. They need to see what really happened on that forecourt, what it looks like when duty means choosing humanity over tradition. Your next Royal Guard story is already waiting for you on screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another moment that proves sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to act when everyone else is just watching.